Right, thanks everyone. Yeah, so I'm Green City Manager. I wasn't checking, but I'm Green City Manager at Birmingham City Council. I'm also a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham, and I have a foot in both camps. And since the year 2000, that's basically what I've been doing, working on research programs and working for the city in trying to bring research to the council to advance their thinking and taking the challenges from the council back to the university to try and break out new ideas. So that's the talk, creating partnerships through an alliance, and something we're having a workshop on this afternoon called the Fair Park Standard or the Future Park Standard, because we're still in debate on that. Where's this all come from? There was a parliamentary inquiry, I'm sure you probably know in this room, in 2016 in Parliament about the future of urban parks in the UK. To the point that the parliamentarians were asking, do we need them? The parliamentarians, I think, thought that actually a few efficiency savings and some new ideas would actually solve the problem with parks. After 6 months, one of the longest running inquiries, and the biggest mailbag they'd had, they realized they didn't have an answer. They just had more problems and more challenges. And they hadn't answered their 3 questions that they'd set out to ask. So they set up a working group, which Chris was a member of, and they also set up a parliamentary group, because when they matched the evidence of what parks affected, it went across 8 government departments, almost everything bar defence. And so it set them thinking as to maybe we're not seeing this quite right. Now, what happened then was that the Future Parks Accelerator came out of that process because National Trust and National Heritage Lottery decided to freeze their People in Parks programme and invest the money into long-term thinking about what is the future. And we were lucky enough to be one of the recipients of that money in Birmingham and received the largest allocation as well of £1 million. What it enabled us to do was that 20 years worth of research that I'd been involved in allowed us to really test that for real in the city. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, because I think there's some real transferable lessons. The first one of those is in relating to one of the challenges that the inquiry asked, which was, what's the number one challenge facing parks? And the overwhelming response from the sector and from the mailbag was funding. Not surprisingly. Actually, I would challenge that and say that the number one problem with the park sector is one of identity. Because historically, everyone thinks they understand what a park is. It's a Victorian model that was passed on, and we've passed that on globally. And they're destinations and places to go to with your family or whatever. The world is no longer in the 19th century. The world is in the 21st century. And we are facing huge global challenges in every city in the world. There's an opportunity to completely and utterly rethink why parks are important. And I'm really pleased that the Green Infrastructure Standard starts with why, because that's something we really need to think about. We, as part of the research team, wrote a little book, and I've got some copies with me if anyone wants it afterwards. But that was the first time a city had looked at this idea of ecosystem services, which is how you can measure the benefits of nature across all its giving qualities, from spirituality to mental health to drainage to the air we breathe, nature is absolutely 100% what we depend on. We can't survive without it. Now, once you start to separate out, rather than having arguments about aesthetically pleasing, once you start to separate out what those key ingredients and benefits are, you can start to map them against what you're doing. This came from the UK's own UK National Ecosystem Assessment. We were the first place in the world as a country to develop an ecosystem assessment. This chart was in the Natural Capital Committee's report, and that was given to the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. It reported directly to the Chancellor of the Exchequer because the consequences of our failing natural environment are now measurable in economic terms, as are the benefits. And this single chart is the reason why we've got a 25-year environment plan. Because the red line shows the decline that's happened that Claire spoke about, and for the UK just since 1970, which has been huge. Now, if you were also looking at the park sector since 1970, you will see, quite honestly, a very similar decline. That graph also works for the whole globe in terms of nature and nature recovery in a large extent. The worrying thing is the red dotted line, which is business as usual. If we don't move away from business as usual, that situation gets worse. And it gets to the point where nature will be so damaged it can't recover. So we have to do something about it, and that's the little circle which was our FPA. We have to rethink nature in cities on a global scale. And we have to recognize that actually every green space in every city and every tree and every garden is contributing to those benefits. And we have to make those invisible benefits visible to decision makers. So we mapped it for Birmingham, and this is the first city in the world to map their ecosystem services and show geographically where the benefits are or aren't. And the reason it's shaded red is that you're looking at a failing city. In relation to the health and well-being of the population and the health of the natural environment, you're looking at a failing city. So that's true and replicated all over the world. And that's why we need to completely rethink why nature needs to exist in every city. What we then did through the FPA, if nature is so important and fundamental to everything we do, is it possible to match those benefits against everything the council promises to do in its council plan? And that's what we set out to do, is for every outcome the city council is committed to, show and demonstrate and make visible how the benefits of nature actually make those outcomes better. And we had a 12-month pilot working with all 4 sectors of the council where they led an initiative in a neighbourhood. And we learned from them and they learned from us in terms of how could it improve housing, how could it improve jobs and skills, health and well-being, and the welfare and future of children. That begs a question about how you're governing your environment and your park system. It also begs a question of who's responsible. Rather than saying, you've got a failing map, for goodness sake, Park Service, pull your finger out. You've got suddenly every part of the council responsible for restoring that failing city. So it's about spreading resource. And we got cabinet approval to set up a City of Nature board, a cross-group of directors looking sideways across all the organizations to look at all the potential synergies and connections, and then an operations group when you actually come to deliver something on the ground. How again can you do that with your public health service, your housing department, your jobs and skills initiative, etc., etc.? How could you collectively take responsibility for making that place a better place? And that whole process was informed by all our third sector organisations, the core ones that we've worked with for years, coming together to form an alliance. We've always worked with them, but we've worked with them independently on different ticket items depending on different projects. They agreed through this that they would form a memorandum of understanding and work with us strategically and have a voice at all of those tables. There's a progression to that, which I'll perhaps come back to, or in the questions. So the question from some of those parties was, how can we tie all this that you're talking about to what the city's overall agenda is? What one city measures against another, what the government measures for each city is done through the index of multiple deprivation. We all know that. And what COVID-19 exposed, which we've heard about this morning, is a completely unequal access to quality green space, virtually in every city in the UK. And we took part in an Urban Parks World Forum online in 2020, where 108 countries took part, and they were all saying exactly the same thing. They also didn't have a solution. This is the index of multiple deprivation, which doesn't count access to green space. So is it surprising that the government don't even know, because it's not on their radar, because it's not in the national data set? They also talk about levelling up. They talk about nature recovery. They talk about climate change. Nowhere in that index of multiple deprivation, on which all those decisions are being based, are we measuring access to green space, climate change, local nature recovery. It's not there. So we've created a new domain, and we're working with DLUC as to whether or not this could be tested elsewhere. And if anyone in the room wants to test it, we'd be really interested. So what we looked at was nationally available data sets, so everyone could do it, access to green space, urban heat island, which we experienced this summer, flood risk, and excess years life loss, which is that whole thing of health lottery. Depending on where you live, your life is compromised perhaps 8 or 11 years from leafy suburbs to inner city. And we mapped it, an environmental justice map. And we think, again, it was the first one that was done in the UK. Automatically, you're identifying the same areas of the city where everyone's interested in levelling up. Everyone's interested in, these are the hotspots for climate change. And you've also got the same wards wrestling with all those other index of multiple deprivation arguments. So you've got an evidence base to work across where all those other government council departments see a logic in working with you. Having done that, and having done those pilots with the 4 arms of the council, the 4 big departments, what we also looked at was, what are the gaps? What aren't we doing? What do we need to bring in that would actually change and improve and embed that change so that it's not just a project, it's changing the way the council thinks and operates into the future. And we identified these gaps. So environmental justice was one, and we've pulled together that map, and that's now been adopted by the council. Again, we're taking that further forward because I'm also working at the university, and we had a meeting with our GIS team at the city, and we're going to convert that into a climate risk and vulnerability assessment for the whole city, which will then dictate all future services and functions. The health side, we're working with public health. The director of the FPA program sends her apologies today. She couldn't be with us. She is a consultant in public health. She ran the FPA program. And in the Healthy City Framework work, what we now have is a health and well-being strategy broken into 5 parts for Birmingham, one of which is all about green and sustainable city and access to green space. That means you're linked into all the health partnerships that exist. We also introduced a sustainable finance workshop working with, chaired by the cabinet member for finance, looking at all the potential there is to attract external green investment. There's a lot more detail in this, and the citizens' involvement was the formation of the alliance. The conclusion was we needed this new governance shift, which is what we've now got. So that was all right working at the city scale. What then do you do at a site level? If you're saying that every site is important in terms of the future, and Councillor Mahmood has said that within our City of Nature strategy, we're talking about Birmingham becoming a city of 1,000 places, which historically used to call itself the city of 1,000 trades, is if each of those spaces is important, how can we measure their importance? There is no minimum benchmark for parks and open spaces. Libraries, schools, GP practices, everything else, museums, they all have inspection regimes and minimum standards. Nothing for parks. So we've been working with the green flag system, but looking at it from the other end, saying that if every site could reach an entry level, then that would be a really powerful standpoint for each community group to be able to then think about the future of those sites. What's also important is that each element of that and each action you take is measured against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Because going back to the finance groups, external finance wants to measure through Sustainable Development Goals. So we developed this sort of finance model, which we've now shared with other people. We've always been very good at micro-funding on a site-by-site scale. But what we need to do is this capacity building across the whole organisation and get into the macro debate about where the big bucks are going to come and how Birmingham's going to change. We're in and at all those tables now. And it's about integration, a complete rethink. And where we're headed is how could we transform that map from what was a whole load of red areas into a truly green Birmingham. And this is our draft local nature recovery strategy map for Birmingham, which is the ambition of where we want to get. And it makes use of every green space available and looks to add more and looks to build on the linkages between. If I tell you that in the external financial markets, there's $21 trillion waiting to invest in cities across the world on two counts: carbon improvements, carbon reductions, and green infrastructure. Because the multiple benefits you get from both of those things will help transform cities. Don't believe there's no money. But this is exactly what Claire was saying earlier. We have to be in these games. We have to completely rethink what this sector is about and rebuild a different approach with partnerships across the organisation and with all our third sector partners as well. So I've come in on time, which is a surprise. What I will mention in that case is that that whole idea of why, what, and how that forms the green infrastructure framework came from the work of Simon Sinek, who's a business guru, who's written a book saying, start with the why. If you haven't read it, I'd say go read it. His latest book is something called The Infinite Game. The problem we've got in this sector and in the whole of the environment and the way things are working is that we've become very proficient at the finite game. We can invest in something, we can measure something, we can get a profit out of it. We don't see the consequences of those things until many, many years later. We have to shift our mindset to the fact that where we are now and the challenges we're now facing is an infinite game. It's never changing, and it's going to continue as never changing. There is no new normal. We have to change into an ever-changing way of thinking and an ever-changing way of working. That has to happen, and the champions for the green space and the environment are sat in this room. Have to find a way of making those invisible benefits visible to your decision making.